The place, a desolate scratch of earth in the Zagros Mountains, designated Forward Operating Base Archer for the 200 soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. It was supposed to be a quiet rotation, a simple observation post monitoring a supposedly dormant smuggling corridor, but at 0400 hours, local time, the quiet shattered. The attack came not with a bang, but with a whisper. First, the satellites went blind, then, the drones dropped from the sky like stones. The digital command net, the lifeblood of the modern US military, dissolved into a blizzard of white noise. Major Elias Thorne, commander of the garrison, watched his bank of monitors die one by one, the friendly blue icons of his platoons winking out into blackness. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any explosion. Then came the mortar. They weren't sporadic or inaccurate. They were a relentless, systematic drumbeat, walking their way across the compound with chilling precision. Whoever was out there in the dark wasn't a ragtag militia. They were professional, disciplined, and they had somehow severed FOB Archer from the rest of the world. Thorne's men were fighting blind, deaf, and alone. They had air support on standby, a flight of F-35s and a squadron of the newest AH-64E Apache gunships, the pride of the fleet, but they were useless. The pilots circled miles away, their multi-million-dollar machines rendered inert by an invisible electronic wall. They could see the flashes of the battle on the horizon, but their targeting pods were haywire, their communications reduced to garbled screams. The battle for FOB Archer was less than 30 minutes old, and it was already a massacre. Thorne, using an old analog field radio, a relic he kept for emergencies, broadcasted into the void. Any US asset, on any frequency, this is Archer Actual. We are being overrun. I repeat, we are being overrun. We are taking effective fire from all sides. We need immediate air support. We are losing. The response was the same crackling static that had been his only companion for the last half hour. His men were dying. The perimeter was buckling. He was preparing to give the order to destroy the sensitive equipment when a new sound cut through the hiss. It was faint, distorted, a woman's voice, unfamiliar, impossibly calm. Archer Actual, the voice said. This is Valkyrie 2-5. I read you faint but clear. What's your status? Thorne had never heard that call sign in his life. 150 miles to the north, Captain Kaylin Rostova banked her AH-64D, Apache longbow over a barren moonlit valley. Her aircraft, tail number 995135, was an antique by current standards, while the rest of the fleet had been upgraded to the Echo model, with its powerful new engines and advanced networking capabilities. Rostova's Delta was a relic of a bygone era. She and her co-pilot gunner, Chief Warrant Officer 3 Elias Vance, were on what the other pilots called a ghost run, a long, pointless patrol over an empty sector, a task assigned to the squadron's least valuable asset. In the pre-flight briefing that morning, the condescension had been palpable. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus, a pilot who had more hours in a simulator than Rostova had in the air, had smirked as he assigned her the route. Try to keep the rust from flaking off. Valkyrie, he'd said, the nickname dripping with sarcasm. It was a call sign she'd inherited from her father, a legendary pilot in his own right, but from her peers it felt like an accusation of living in his shadow. Rostova had simply nodded, her face an unreadable mask. She was used to it. She was the quiet woman who flew the old bird, the one who spent her OFOs in the hangar with the maintenance crews instead of at the officers' club. They mistook her silence for arrogance, her focus for a lack of camaraderie. Vance, strapped in the front seat, knew better. He'd flown with her for 3 years. He'd seen her fly the aging gunship in ways that defied its own technical manuals. He'd watched her diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone. He knew the calm was not arrogance. It was absolute, unshakable competence. It was Vance who first caught the garbled transmission. Ma'am, got something on the guard frequency. Sounds like a distress call. He tweaked the dials, filtering out the atmospheric noise. Major Thorne's desperate plea bled through the speaker. Overrun, need immediate air support. Rostova listened, her head tilted slightly. The coordinates he was broadcasting were deep inside the sector, protected by Marcus's state-of-the-art squadron. They should have been handling this. Patch it through to command, she ordered, her voice flat. Vance tried. No joy, ma'am. Main comms are a mess. It's like the whole spectrum is being carpet-bombed with static. Rostova looked south, toward the distant mountains. She could see nothing, but she could feel the pull of the crisis. A dissonance in the rhythm of the night. The rules of engagement were clear. Stay in your assigned sector. Do not engage without orders. But the voice on the radio was the sound of men dying. Bring us about, Rostova said. The command was so quiet Vance almost missed it. Ma'am. You heard me, Elias. Plot a course for Fob Archer. Maximum continuous power. Vance's hands froze over the controls. Captain, we don't have orders. Command hasn't. Command is deaf. She cut him off, her tone leaving no room for argument. By the time they figure out what's happening, there won't be anyone left to save. Plot the course. Vance hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, the image of a court-martial flashing in his mind. Flying into another squadron's area of operations, engaging an unknown enemy force without authorization, it was a career-ending move. But then he looked at the back of her helmet in the dim green light of the cockpit. He saw the rigid set of her shoulders, the focused intensity that radiated from her. This wasn't recklessness, it was a decision. He trusted her decisions more than he trusted the entire command staff back at base. Course laid in. Ma'am, he said, his voice now steady. ETA 25 minutes. The old Apache groaned as Rostova pushed the collective down, tipping the helicopter's nose toward the horizon and accelerating into a near-silent dive. The narrator's voice would later describe this moment as the fulcrum on which the entire battle turned. While a fleet of the most advanced aircraft in the world sat paralyzed, a single, outdated gunship, flown by a pilot universally underestimated by her peers, was now hurtling toward a fight everyone else believed was already lost. The mystery of the enemy's power was a question for later. How could they jam everything from GPS to encrypted radio signals? What kind of electronic warfare package could neutralize an F-35? These were questions the generals were asking. Rostova was concerned with a much simpler, more brutal calculus. An American position was being overrun. She had a helicopter armed with 30mm cannon, Hellfire missiles, and Hydra rockets. The math was simple. As they flew, the electronic interference grew stronger. The digital map on her main display flickered and died, replaced by a screen of useless static. The advanced targeting system, the longbow radar that gave her aircraft its name, failed with a pathetic chirp. Vance swore under his breath. We're blind, Kalen. Rostova didn't answer. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, flipping a series of covered switches on the console. The screens remained dead, but the low hum of the analog gyros spooled up. She was taking them back in time, to an era of flight that depended on stick, rudder, and instinct. No, she said, her voice calm over the intercom. We have our eyes. They crossed the ridgeline into the Archer sector, and the sky itself seemed to turn toxic. The electronic noise was so intense it manifested as a physical sensation, a low hum that vibrated through the airframe and into their bones. Below them, the landscape was a tapestry of chaos. Tracers, green from the enemy and red from the American forces, stitched fiery lines through the darkness. The fob was a hornet's nest, and they were about to fly right into it. On the command frequency, which was now miraculously clearing as they got closer, they could hear the other pilots. Their voices were a mixture of frustration and panic. Raptor 1, my targeting is shot. I can't get a lock on anything. Dragon 7, I'm Winchester on flares, and my RWR is screaming. This is a goddamn hornet's nest of SAMs. Then, another voice cut in, laced with disbelief. Is that a Delta model? What the hell is Valkyrie doing here? Rostova ignored them all. Her world had shrunk to the view outside her canopy and the feedback coming through the flight controls. The sophisticated helmet-mounted display was dead. The advanced sensors were useless. She was flying on what the old-timers called Mark I eyeball, and the Apache felt more alive under her touch than it ever had with the computers engaged. Elias, she said, her voice steady, talk to me. What do you see? Vance, his face pressed against the optical sight of the target acquisition and designation system. TADS was now her radar. He manually scanned the battlefield, his thumbs slewing the turreted sensor. I see God, Kalen. It's a slaughter. They've breached the south wall. I'm counting at least 8 armored vehicles. Looks like BTRs, multiple heavy machine gun nests. On the ridge to the west, missiles. I can't get a heat signature, but with this much chaos, they have to have manpads down there, man-portable air defense systems. The bane of any helicopter pilot. Without her digital countermeasure suite, they were a flying coffin. The other pilots heard their exchange. The mockery started almost immediately. She's flying in blind. Is she insane? Someone order her to stand down before she gets herself killed. Marcus's voice, tight with fury, broke through. Valkyrie 225, this is Archangel. What in the hell do you think you're doing? You are not cleared for this engagement. I order you to reverse course immediately. Rostova's thumb rested on the transmit button. She didn't press it. Her eyes were scanning the battlefield, not as a pilot but as a hunter. She saw the geometry of the fight, the firing lanes, the points of vulnerability. The enemy was focused on the ground, confident that the air was theirs. They were wrong, Elias, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. See the gun nest at grid 4279er? Got it. Put a rocket in it. Major Thorne was on his belly, in the dirt behind the burning husk of a Humvee, firing his M4 in short, controlled bursts. The south wall was gone. The enemy was inside the wire. He could hear their strange guttural shouts over the screams of his own wounded men. This was it. The end. He was calculating how many bullets he had left when he heard it, a sound that did not belong in this battle. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a jet engine or the electronic buzz of a drone. It was a deep, guttural hump that seemed to beat in time with his own heart. He looked up and saw a silhouette against the pre-dawn sky. It was an Apache, but it was flying wrong. It was too low, too fast, hugging the terrain like a phantom. It wasn't circling at a safe distance, trying to get a missile lock. It was on a strafing run like something out of an old war movie. The Apache crested the ridge, and for a moment, it was illuminated by the fires within the fob. Thorne could see the older angular lines of the Delta model, a museum piece. The enemy saw it too. A dozen machine guns turned toward it, spitting green tracers into the sky. But the helicopter was already gone, dipping below the ridgeline, using the earth itself as a shield. Then, from its unseen position, a single rocket shot out, a fiery dart in the darkness. It slammed into the heavy machine gun nest on the western ridge that had been pinning down his entire Bravo company. The nest vanished in a bloom of fire and smoke. A cheer went up from the beleaguered Rangers. On the command net, the other pilots were speechless. They had been trying to target that same position for 20 minutes, their advanced systems unable to cut through the electronic fog. Valkyrie had done it with a single, unguided rocket. Rostova pulled the Apache into a tight, good trenching turn, the GI forces pressing her into her seat. Next target, Elias, she said, her breathing even. The BTRs at the breach, they clustered together, infantry all around them. Vance warned, it's a hot target. Good, Rostova replied. They'll be looking up now. She brought the gunship around, not from the same angle, but from the south, a direction they wouldn't expect. She flew so low that the rotor wash kicked up clouds of dust and debris. The enemy infantry scattered, their attention drawn by the sudden, terrifying noise. They were looking in the wrong direction. The Apache popped up from behind a destroyed building inside the fob itself, a ghost appearing in the heart of the inferno. This time she didn't use rockets. The 30mm M230 chain gun under the nose of the Apache was an extension of her will. Linked to the gunner's helmet in modern Apaches, Vance had to control it manually, using the TAD's optics like a sniper's scope. In Rostova's hands, the effect was devastatingly precise. The gun erupted not in a wild spray but in a series of short, controlled bursts. Each 3-round burst was a thunderclap that echoed across the battlefield. The high-explosive dual-purpose rounds tore through the thin armor of the BTRs as if it were paper. The first vehicle exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a shower of sparks. The second had its turret ripped clean off. The third, she disabled, shredding its tires and engine block, turning it into a piece of useless cover for Thorne's men. The infantry caught in the open were decimated. It wasn't a barrage, it was surgery. She wasn't targeting men. She was eliminating threats, one by one, with an efficiency that was both terrifying and beautiful. Major Thorne watched, mesmerized. He had seen air support before. He had seen the clinical, detached destruction wrought by drones and high-altitude bombers. This was different. This was personal. The pilot in that helicopter was fighting with them, not for them. She was in the dirt, in the fire, her machine a part of the brutal ground war. The tone on the radio net had shifted again. The mockery was gone, replaced by a stunned, confused silence. The other pilots were watching a masterclass in a type of flying they had only read about in textbooks. They were trained to rely on their systems, to trust the computer to guide their weapons. Valkyrie was the system. How is she doing that? One pilot whispered over the open channel. Her targeting pod should be useless. She's not using the pod, another replied, his voice filled with dawning realization. She's using the gunner's direct optics, and, my God, she's walking the rounds onto the target. Manually, Vance's voice was a low growl of concentration in her ear. Target neutralized, Kalen. We're drawing a lot of fire. Small arms RPGs, I feel it, she said. The airframe was shuddering as rounds pinged off the armored cockpit. An RPG streaked past, close enough for them to feel the heat of its rocket motor. She didn't flinch. She was already moving, jinking the helicopter left, then right, never presenting a stable target. She was using the burning vehicles and destroyed buildings as temporary cover, a deadly game of hide-and-seek. The enemy, who had been on the verge of victory just minutes before, was now in disarray. Their command and control shattered by the sudden, savage appearance of the lone gunship. The enemy commander was not a fool. He was watching the battle from a fortified position miles away, his screens showing him the same electronic snow that had blinded the Americans, but his ground commanders were screaming over their own radios about a single, ghost-like helicopter that was tearing their assault apart. He had planned for F-35s, for Reaper drones, for modern Apaches. He had not planned for a pilot who could fight without her computers. He gave a calm, cold order: unleash the swarm, and activate the hunter. From hidden launch sites around the valley, a new threat emerged. They were small, fast, and intelligent, a swarm of autonomous attack drones. Their simple optical sensors, unaffected by the complex electronic warfare, they rose into the air like a cloud of angry hornets and streaked toward the lone Apache. Simultaneously, from a camouflaged hangar carved into the side of a mountain, a much larger shape lifted into the air. It was a Mi-24 Hind, a flying tank of a helicopter, heavily armed and armored, its cockpit glowing with the light of modern avionics. It was an old airframe, like the Apache, but it had been retrofitted for this new kind of war. Vance saw the drones first. Multiple fast, 9 o'clock, they're not on radar. It's visual. The sky to their left was suddenly filled with dozens of small, dark shapes. Rostova didn't hesitate. Flares, she snapped. A stream of brilliant magnesium flares erupted from the Apache's pods, designed to confuse heat-seeking missiles. It was a gamble. The drones were likely optical or radar-guided, but the intense, blinding light might be enough to overwhelm their simple sensors. For a moment, it worked. The swarm scattered, confused by the sudden glare, but then they regrouped, their networked intelligence re-establishing a target lock. They dove Rostova through the Apache into a series of violent, evasive maneuvers. She wasn't just dodging, she was fighting in 3 dimensions. She used the rotor wash of her own blades to buffet the smaller drones, sending them tumbling. She scraped the ground, using the dust to obscure her position. She fired the chain gun in a wide sweeping arc, not aiming, but creating a wall of lead that shredded a half-dozen of the attackers. It was a desperate, brilliant defense, but there were too many. One of the drones got through, slamming into the right engine nacelle with a deafening bang. Warning lights flared across the cockpit. The right engine was overheating. They were losing power. And it was then, as they limped from the hornet's nest, that the Hind appeared. It rose over the ridgeline, a predator emerging from the shadows, its profile unmistakable. It was bigger, better armed, and now, it had a wounded target. The Hind pilot, call sign XME Snake, was an arrogant man. He was a veteran of a dozen brushfire wars, a mercenary who flew for the highest bidder. He saw the smoking, struggling American Apache and smiled. This would not be a fight. This would be an execution. All units, he broadcasted in Russian. To his commander, the American Ghost is wounded. I am moving in to finish it. On the American command net, the other pilots could only listen in abject horror. They could see the 2 helicopter icons on their restored short-range tactical displays, the massive, heavily armed Hind closing in on the crippled Apache. Valkyrie, you have a Hind on your tail. Brake, brake. She can't outrun it. Not with that engine damage. Where the hell did that thing come from? Marcus's voice was strained. Valkyrie 225, disengage. I repeat, disengage immediately. That's a direct order. Rostova's breathing was the only sound on her intercom. She was fighting the controls, the helicopter vibrating violently, the damaged engine screaming in protest. Elias status on the engine, she said, her voice tight but still controlled. It's holding, but barely. We're a flying brick killer. We can't maneuver. We don't need to maneuver, she replied. We just need to fly straight. Vance didn't understand. Flying straight would make them an easy target. The Hind was already getting a missile lock. He could hear the high-pitched squeal of the tone. In his helmet, missile lock, he's got a lock. XME fired. A plume of smoke erupted from the Hind's wingtip as an air-to-air missile shot forward. Accelerating rapidly, its seeker head locked onto the heat signature of the Apache's failing engine. It was a perfect shot. A guaranteed kill. The American pilots watching on their screens closed their eyes. Major Thorne, on the ground, saw the missile streak toward the helicopter that had saved his men and let out a curse. This was it, the end of their miracle. But Rostova did something no one expected. She didn't brake left or right. She didn't try to dive. Instead, she pulled the collective, forcing the last ounce of power from her dying engines, and climbed. The Apache clawed its way upward, directly into the path of the missile. It was a suicidal move. The missile, designed to chase a fleeing target, was suddenly faced with a target that was closing the distance. Its proximity fuse, calibrated for a tail chase, became confused. The missile didn't know whether to detonate or to continue to its target. In that split second of electronic indecision, Rostova yawed the helicopter violently to the right. The missile, its guidance fins struggling to adjust, streaked past, missing them by less than 20 feet. It exploded harmlessly in the air behind them, the shockwave buffeting the Apache like a giant hand. The maneuver, however, was too much for the damaged airframe. There was a sound like tearing metal, a high-pitched scream from the tail of the helicopter. The tail rotor, which counteracted the torque of the main blades, had been damaged by the stress. The Apache began to spin, a slow, sickening rotation that was rapidly getting worse. "We've lost tail rotor authority," Vance yelled, fighting to stay conscious as the centrifugal force pressed him against the side of the cockpit. "We're going in." This was how her father had died. The thought flashed through Rostova's mind, cold and sharp. The official report on his crash had been loss of tail rotor authority during extreme combat maneuvers. They had called it pilot error. They said he pushed the aircraft too hard, that he got arrogant. She had spent her entire life studying the report, rereading the technical data, convinced they were wrong. She knew with a certainty that was etched into her soul that there was a way to fly out of it. He had taught her in hushed tones in the garage late at night, sketching diagrams on a greasy chalkboard. A theoretical maneuver, one that existed only on paper, one the engineers said was impossible. "If you lose the tail," he had told her, his voice filled with a quiet intensity, "the books will tell you to cut the power and auto-rotate down too. Surrender to the fall." But the Apache, she doesn't want to fall, she wants to fly. You just have to let her. Now, with the ground rushing up to meet them and the helicopter spinning out of control, his voice was as clear in her mind as if he was sitting beside her. She didn't cut the power. She did the opposite. She pushed the throttle forward, feeding more power to the main rotor. The spin accelerated, becoming a dizzying, violent vortex. "Kalen, what are you doing?" Vance screamed. She didn't answer. Her feet danced on the anti-torque pedals, which were now useless for steering but could still change the pitch of the tail rotor blades. She was feeling the air, listening to the tortured screams of the machinery, searching for the moment her father had described, the point of equilibrium, the eye of the storm. Then she found it. She slammed the pedals hard left, then feathered them, using the slight residual aerodynamic force of the damaged blades, not to stop the spin, but to shape it. The violent, uncontrolled rotation smoothed out into a stable, flat pirouette. They were still spinning, but they were no longer falling. They were flying, a controlled, spinning descent. It was impossible, but she was doing it. From the cockpit of the Hinds, Xme watched with smug satisfaction. The American helicopter was spinning, trailing smoke, clearly out of control. It was a classic kill. He had broken the Apache, forced the pilot into a fatal error. He watched it disappear behind a low, rocky ridgeline, expecting to see the bright orange blossom of its impact. He keyed his mic. "Target destroyed," he reported. "The Ghost is down." A wave of relief washed over the enemy ground forces. The terrifying, unpredictable gunship was gone. They began to regroup, to press their attack on the beleaguered fob Archer once more. On the American command net, the mood was somber. "We've lost her, goddammit. She almost made it. SAR teams, start spinning up. We need to get to that crash site." Major Thorne slammed his fist into the dirt. He had allowed himself to hope, and that hope had just been extinguished. He looked at his men, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. Their brief reprieve was over. The main assault would begin again any second. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus, circling miles away in his pristine, untouched Apache, felt a pang of something he didn't recognize. It might have been guilt. He had sent her on that ghost run. He had dismissed her, belittled her, and she had flown into the heart of a battle he and his advanced squadron couldn't touch, and she had almost turned the tide. He had ordered her to retreat, and she had died. The weight of that settled on him, heavy and cold. The Hind, its primary threat eliminated, turned its attention back to the fob. Its weapons pods bristled with rockets and missiles. Its 30mm cannon was loaded. XME was going to enjoy this. He would finish what the ground troops had started. He descended slowly, majestically, a predator savoring its victory. He flew over the very ridgeline where the Apache had disappeared, positioning himself to rain fire down upon Thorne's command post. The battle was over. The silence on the radio was a funereal pall. The only sounds were the crackle of fires and the distant, triumphant shouts of the enemy. It was a silence of defeat, of resignation, a silence waiting to be broken by the final, bloody end. But then, a new sound entered the frequency. It wasn't static, it wasn't a scream. It was a voice. Kalen Rostova's voice. And it was no longer .com, it was cold as the space between stars, and it was speaking to every American pilot in the sky. The voice cut through the command net with the clarity of a diamond blade. It was directed at no one in particular, yet it was for everyone, for the pilots circling helplessly miles away, for the men fighting for their lives on the ground, for the ghost of her father, for the arrogant mercenary in the Hind who thought he had won check 6, just 2 words. It was pilot shorthand, a phrase as old as air combat itself. It meant check your 6 o'clock position, look behind you. It was a warning, a desperate cry from a wingman spotting a threat, but this wasn't a warning, it was a death sentence. XME in the cockpit of the Hind heard the transmission. He didn't understand the English words, but he recognized the tone. It was the sound of a hunter, not the hunted. He frowned, confused. The American helicopter was a burning wreck on the other side of this ridge. What could possibly be behind him? The American pilots understood. A collective gasp went through the squadron. But, did she say, check 6? Who's she talking to? Marcus's eyes widened in his cockpit. He looked at his tactical display. The icon for Valkyrie 225 was gone, presumed destroyed. The icon for the Hind was hovering, stationary, over the battlefield. There was nothing else there. It didn't make sense. But the authority in her voice, the chilling finality of it, sent a shiver down his spine. Major Thorne heard it on his field radio. He didn't understand the pilot jargon, but he knew that voice. The pilot of the ghost helicopter, she was alive. On the other side of the ridge, Rostova had completed the impossible maneuver. Using the pirouette her father had theorized, she had not crashed, but descended with controlled precision into a narrow, hidden ravine. The spin had extinguished the engine fire. She was shielded from view, her helicopter battered but alive. As the Hind had passed over the ridge above her, she had done the last thing any pilot in the world would have thought to do. She had restarted. Her engines, the damaged tail rotor, still made steering impossible in the traditional sense. But she didn't need to steer, she just needed to go up. She pulled on the collective, and the Apache, screaming in protest, leaped vertically from the ravine, a ghost rising from its own grave. Directly behind and below the hovering Hind, Elias Vance, his vision swimming back into focus, saw the massive dark shape of the Hind filling their entire canopy. They were so close he could see the rivets on its fuselage. The Hind's pilot was completely oblivious, his attention focused on the fob below. They were in the ultimate blind spot. Holy, Vance breathed. Target, Rostova said, her voice a clipped, precise instrument of war. Acquired. Vance's hands, guided by pure muscle memory, moved to the weapons controls. The advanced radar-guided Hellfire missiles were useless. Their systems were still fried. But they had one missile left that didn't need a computer. The AGM-114K, a laser-guided variant. It was older technology, but robust, reliable. He flipped the arming switch. Laser on, he said, his voice trembling slightly. He placed the laser designator, a tiny, invisible dot of light, directly onto the Hind's exhaust port. Ready to fire. Fire, Rostova commanded. A single Hellfire missile dropped from the rail on the Apache's stubby wing. It fell for a moment, before its rocket motor ignited with a roar, and it leaped toward the target. The flight was less than 2 seconds long. XME in the Hind's cockpit never even heard the warning tone. His first and last indication that something was wrong was a sudden, brilliant flash of light in his rearview mirror. The Hellfire missile, following Vance's laser spot with unerring accuracy, flew directly into the Hind's engine compartment. The result was catastrophic. The Hind's fuel tanks, full and volatile, detonated. The entire helicopter simply ceased to exist, replaced by a roiling, expanding ball of fire that lit up the entire valley. The shockwave, even at that close range, rocked the Apache violently. The command net, which had been filled with confused chatter, went utterly, profoundly silent. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fireball on the open channel. and the sound of Kalen Rostova's steady, rhythmic breathing. She had done it. She had faced down a superior enemy in a crippled machine and had not just survived, but dominated. She had avenged the threat, and in that moment, her call sign was no longer an insult. It was a prophecy fulfilled. She was Valkyrie, and she had just chosen the slain dot. The destruction of the Hind was more than just the elimination of a single threat. It was a decapitation strike. The enemy commander, watching his screens, had lost his queen from the chessboard. The swarm drones, without their master controller, reverted to a default protocol, circling aimlessly before their fuel ran out and they dropped from the sky. The enemy ground forces, who had just witnessed their seemingly invincible air support get annihilated, were thrown into chaos and confusion. Their morale shattered. For the first time that night, the relentless pressure on Fob Archer lessened. In the cockpit of the Apache, Rostova fought to keep the crippled helicopter in the air. The tail rotor was gone, and she was maintaining a controlled, hovering spin, a feat of piloting that was draining her both mentally and physically. But her mind was clearer than it had ever been. The battle wasn't over. Elias, she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence on the radio. Talk to Archer, Actual. I want to trap every enemy position you can see. Ma'am, do it. We're not leaving. Vance, shaking off his AW, patched through to Major Thorne's frequency. Archer, Actual. This is Valkyrie 225. How copy? Thorne, who had watched the Hind explode with tears of disbelief in his eyes, scrambled for his radio. Valkyrie, we copy. We copy. You got him. Sitrap. Major Rostova's voice cut in. All business. Now, shaken into action, Thorne began calling out enemy positions, his voice gaining strength and confidence with every word. We have heavy machine gun fire from the eastern rocks, grid 8 to 1 Alpha, mortar teams in the dry riverbed to the north. As Thorne spoke, Rostova, unable to aim the helicopter's nose, was doing something else. She was using the Apache's slow, predictable spin to her advantage. The helicopter was now a 360-degree observation platform. As it rotated, she and Vance methodically scanned the entire battlefield, their eyes and the TADS optics picking out targets the men on the ground couldn't see. I see the mortar, Vance said. 3 tubes, hidden behind a rock outcropping. Archer, Actual. Rostova broadcasted her voice, now commanding the entire battlefield. Direct your fire to grid 8 to 2 Charlie, 100 meters north of the river bend. You have 3 mortar teams in the open. The American pilots, still circling uselessly, listened in stunned admiration. She couldn't shoot, but she had become the eyes of the entire friendly force. She was the battlefield commander, hovering in a broken machine over the heart of the fight, orchestrating the defense. A new voice came over the command net. It was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus's. The arrogance and anger were gone, replaced by a tone of humbled, absolute respect. Valkyrie 225. This is Archangel. We are on station. Our targeting systems are still down, but we have ordnance. We are at your command. It was an unprecedented moment. A squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel, was handing control of his unit to a captain in a crippled aircraft. But in that moment, rank meant nothing. Technology meant nothing. There was only one person in the sky who knew how to fight this war, and it was Kalen Rostova. Archangel, she replied, her voice not betraying a hint of surprise. Glad you could join us. I need you to be my gun. I will walk you in. What followed was a masterclass in teamwork and improvisation. Rostova would identify a target. Archangel, do you see the burned-out T-72 on the western approach? Affirmative. Valkyrie, your target is a command vehicle, camouflaged 200 meters to its left, at the base of the cliff. I don't have it on sensors. I don't care about your sensors, Rostova snapped. Look out your damn window. Put your nose on the target and fire a dumb bomb when I tell you to. She guided him in, using simple, direct language. Little more to the left. Steady. Hold your altitude. Fire. Now. Marcus, flying on pure trust, released the weapon. The 500-pound bomb fell, unguided, and landed exactly where Rostova had indicated, erupting in a massive explosion that vaporized the hidden enemy command vehicle. One by one, she directed the other pilots. She turned their useless state-of-the-art fighters and gunships into extensions of her own will. They became her weapons, their pilots her hands. The mockery was a distant memory. The condescension was gone. In its place was a fierce, protective loyalty. They were her wingman now, in a way that went deeper than any squadron roster. They were Valkyrie Squadron. On the ground, Thorne's men, emboldened by the sudden, brutally effective air support, launched a counterattack. They pushed the disorganized enemy out of the breach, retaking the perimeter wall. The tide of the battle, which had been a torrent of defeat, had been turned back. It was now a rout. The enemy was breaking, fleeing into the mountains, hunted from the air by a ghost and her newfound legion. The battle was won, but Rostova's fight was far from over. Warning lights blinked all over her console. Her fuel was critically low. The transmission was screaming, threatening to tear itself apart. The Apache was dying, and she was asking it to hold on for just a few more minutes. "Elias," she said, her voice strained. "We need to clear an LZ. The QRF is 5 minutes out." The Quick Reaction Force, a company of infantry and Black Hawk helicopters, was the final nail in the enemy's coffin, but they needed a safe place to land. The main helipad at FOB Archer was a flaming junkyard. Vance scanned the area. "There's a clear patch on the north side, near the motor pool, but it's still taking sporadic sniper fire from the hills." "Target the sniper," Rostova ordered. "I can't see him," Vance replied, his eyes straining through the optics. "Then we draw his fire." Before Vance could protest, she did the unthinkable. She stopped the controlled spin. Using the last vestiges of her damaged controls, she held the Apache steady, its broadside facing the hills at a perfect, stationary target. It was an act of incredible bravery, an incredible foolishness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a puff of smoke from a rocky outcropping 1,000 meters away. A high-velocity round slammed into the armored glass of the cockpit. In front of Vance's face, the glass starred but held. "Got you," Vance whispered. He laid the laser on the sniper's position. "Archangel," Rostova said into the radio, her voice tight with the strain of holding the helicopter steady. "Last target. My laser." Marcus, already anticipating the move, was diving. On it, Valkyrie firing cannon, his Apache's 30mm gun, ripped the sniper's nest apart in a hail of explosive shells. The landing zone was clear. As the first of the friendly Black Hawks touched down, Rostova's aircraft gave a final shuddering groan. The transmission failed. The main rotor began. Too slow, they were falling. "We're done, Kalen," Vance said, his voice strangely calm. "It was a good run." "Not yet," she gritted out. She was in a deadfall of irritation, the one maneuver she had been trained her whole life to perform, the maneuver her father had supposedly failed. She guided the falling helicopter toward the newly cleared landing zone. Her touch on the controls, gentle, coaxing. They hit the ground hard, the landing gear collapsing under the impact, the fuselage slamming into the dirt with a deafening screech of metal. But they were down, they were safe. The blades spun down with a final, weary sigh. The silence in the cockpit was absolute. The destruction of the command vehicle Marcus had bombed had an unintended, immediate effect. As the vehicle exploded, the electronic warfare field that had paralyzed the region collapsed. Across the valley, in the cockpits of a dozen aircraft, screens flickered back to life. Targeting pods reacquired their connection to the satellites. Radios cleared. The digital world, in all its clarity and precision, came rushing back. The pilots, who had been forced to rely on the voice of a single woman, were suddenly flooded. With data, they could see the full picture now, the scattered remnants of the enemy force fleeing into the mountains, the secure perimeter of FOB Archer, the friendly icons of the arriving reinforcements. And they could see something else. In the center of the landing zone sat the icon for Valkyrie 225, blinking red. Below it, in stark digital text, were the words, "Aircraft disabled, catastrophic system failure." The battle was over, but the full scope of what had happened was just beginning to be understood. An investigation was launched immediately. The enemy had been using a new generation of EW technology, something no one had ever seen before. It didn't just jam signals. It infiltrated and corrupted the networked software that ran every modern piece of military hardware, turning billion-dollar assets into paperweights. It was a weapon that could have crippled the entire US military, and the only thing that had stood in its way was an old helicopter with analog backups and a pilot who knew how to use them. Rostova's flight recorder was recovered from the wreck. When the analysts played it back, they were stunned. They saw the impossible maneuver that had saved her from the missile. They saw the controlled spin that had defied the laws of aerodynamics. They saw a level of pure, instinctual piloting that no simulator could teach, that no computer could replicate. They saw a ghost in the machine. Rostova had become the de facto air commander not just through bravery, but through necessity. Her obsolete technology had made her immune to the enemy's greatest weapon. She had been the only one who could see, the only one who could think, the only one who could fight. The irony was not lost on the generals at the Pentagon. They had spent trillions developing a force that could be defeated by simply turning off its computers. They had forgotten the most important lesson of warfare, that technology is a tool, not a substitute for the warrior who wields it. Medics and firefighters swarmed the downed Apache, but they were waved off by Vance, who had climbed out of the forward cockpit, shaken but unharmed. He walked to Rustova's door and pulled the handle. It was jammed. He had to pry it open with a crowbar. Callan Rostova was just sitting there, her hands still resting lightly on the controls. Her helmet was off, her face pale and streaked with sweat in the dim light of the emergency floodlights. She was staring out at the chaotic scene of the no-secure base, but her eyes seemed to be looking at something much farther awake. Vance said softly, "Are you okay?" She turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw the immense exhaustion in her eyes. She gave a slow, single nod. She had done it. She had flown the impossible flight, fought the impossible fight, and brought them home. As they helped her down from the cockpit, a path cleared through the crowd of soldiers. Major Elias Thorne walked toward her. His uniform was torn and filthy, his face covered in soot, but he stood tall, his eyes locked on the woman who had saved his command. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He stopped in front of her, brought his hand up in a sharp, perfect salute, and held it. All around them, the Rangers of the 3rd Battalion, the battle-hardened soldiers she had pulled from, the fire followed their commander's lead. One by one, they saluted. It was a silent, profound tribute, a moment of pure, unadulterated respect for the quiet pilot and her old bird. Rostova, overwhelmed, simply stood there for a moment, then returned Thorne's salute, her gesture as crisp and precise as any of her maneuvers in the air. The barrier she had kept around herself for so long, the quiet wall she had built to deflect the mockery and the condescension, finally crumbled. In the middle of the wreckage of her helicopter, surrounded by the men whose lives she had saved, Captain Callan Rostova finally allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had done. She was no longer just a pilot. She was a legend. The debriefing was held in a secure video conference room 2 days later. Rostova sat at one end of the table, flanked by Vance. On the screen were the faces of generals, intelligence analysts, and the other pilots from the battle, including a subdued and humbled Lieutenant Colonel Marcus. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with disciplinary action. It was They played the recordings, the garbled distress calls, the initial mockery on the command net, her calm, clipped orders, the chilling Check 6, and the final, coordinated destruction of the enemy. They showed the data from a flight recorder, with analysts pointing out the moments where she pushed the Apache past every known engineering limit. One general, a stern-faced man with 4 stars on his collar, leaned forward. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice gravelly, "the official report states that your father, Colonel Andrei Rostova, crashed his aircraft attempting a similar maneuver to the one you executed to escape the missile attack. The report concluded it was pilot error." Rostova met his gaze, her own eyes unblinking. "The report was wrong, sir. Your flight data seems to suggest that," the general conceded, "you not only executed the maneuver, you recovered from a subsequent loss of tail rotor authority that was, by all accounts, a non-survivable event. You seem to have done the impossible twice." "I was trained by the best, sir," she said quietly. Marcus cleared his throat. "General," he said, his voice unsteady, "I wanted on the record that my initial assessment of Captain Rostova's actions was incorrect. I ordered her to disengage. She disobeyed that order, and in doing so, she saved the lives of every man at FOB Archer, and likely prevented a strategic defeat of catastrophic proportions. Her actions were the single most extraordinary display of airmanship and courage I have ever witnessed." The general nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on Rostova. The investigation into the EW attack was already sending shockwaves through the military establishment. They had been caught completely unprepared, their technological superiority rendered meaningless. Rostova hadn't just won a battle, she had exposed a fundamental weakness in the heart of America's warfighting doctrine, and she had shown them the way to fix it. After the formal debriefing, the 4-star general asked to speak with Rostova alone. The screen went blank, leaving just the two of them in the quiet room. "Captain," he began, his tone softer now, "after reviewing your flight data, I took the liberty of reopening your father's accident file. It's been classified for 20 years. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It seems your father was not on a routine training flight, as the official story claimed. He was testing the absolute limits of the Delta model Apache's airframe, specifically its ability to handle damage to the tail rotor. He believed there was a way to fly the aircraft out of a fatal spin. A theory his superiors and the engineers dismissed as reckless. He slid a file across the table. It was thin, its cover stamped with the words "Top Secret." He documented his theory, his proposed maneuver. "It's identical to the one you performed. The one that saved you." Restova opened the file. Inside were her father's handwritten notes, the same diagrams he had drawn for her on the garage chalkboard. All those years ago, the official report was a cover-up, the general continued, not to blame him, but to hide a potential flaw in the Apache's design. It was easier to blame a dead pilot than to ground the entire fleet. "Your flight captain has proven his theory correct. It wasn't pilot error that killed him. He was on the verge of a breakthrough, and something went wrong with the aircraft." Rostova looked up from the file, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The weight she had carried her entire life, the shadow of her father's supposed failure, was finally lifted. He hadn't been reckless. He had been a visionary. He had been trying to find a way to save pilots, and in the end, the knowledge he had passed on to his daughter had done just that. "We are posthumously awarding your father the Distinguished Flying Cross," the general said, "and his official cause of death will be amended. The record will show that he died in the heroic service of his country." Her personal mission, the one that had driven her to be better, to fly harder, to understand her machine more deeply than anyone else, was over. Her call sign, Valkyrie, had taken on its final, true meaning. She hadn't just chosen the slain in battle, she had flown into the pages of history and redeemed the name of a fallen hero. She had brought her father home. The story of Valkyrie and the battle for Fob Archer became a quiet legend within the military, a cautionary tale whispered in ready rooms and studied at war colleges. It never made the public news, but its impact was profound. The Valkyrie Doctrine, as it came to be known, was born. A new emphasis was placed on manual piloting skills, on understanding the analog guts of the machines, not just their digital skins. Simulators were reprogrammed to include catastrophic system failure scenarios. A new generation of pilots learned not just how to fly the plane, but how to fly when the plane no longer wanted to. Captain Kaylin Rostova was awarded the Medal of Honor. She accepted it not in the White House, but in a quiet ceremony at the hangar, surrounded by the mechanics who had kept her old bird flying, and the pilots of her squadron, who now looked at her with a reverence once reserved for aces of old. She could have had any posting she wanted, any command, but she chose to stay, to fly her now repaired legendary Apache, and to teach. The final shot of the documentary is not of her in the cockpit, but of her standing on the flight line at dusk. The sky is a brilliant tapestry of orange and purple. A young pilot, barely out of flight school, approaches her nervously, asking a question about torque and rotor dynamics. Rostova turns, and the camera focuses on her face. The quiet, underestimated woman is gone. In her place is a leader, a mentor, her eyes reflecting the endless sky she has mastered. Her legacy is not in the medals or the accolades. It is in the pilots she will train, in the lives that will be saved by the lessons learned in a dark valley, miles from home. Her call sign is no longer an echo of her father's past, but a beacon for the future. She is Valkyrie, and she is still watching the sky.